I want you to calm down and take a deep breath because today's story is really special. Relax, inhale deeply, and get ready to dive into an amazing tale. Tonight, we're pulling on ragged fur mittens, stepping off the beaten path and walking straight into the frozen teeth of the American wilderness. Out here, there's no thermostat, no grocery store, and definitely no heated seats idling outside. It's just you, your grit, and the very real chance that if you don't learn fast, the land will chew you up, spit you out, and bury you under 10 feet of snow. In other words, you probably won't survive this, unless you learn to build a cabin that can. Quick thing before we dive in, if you enjoy these stories, hit like and subscribe. It really helps me out and helps this new channel reach 10K subscribers. Drop a comment and tell me where you're tuning in from and what time it is there. Now dim the lights. Maybe flip on a fan for that soft background hum. Let's ease into the night. The frontier is a cruel tutor. Snow crunches under each step until your legs feel like lead. Cold bites through leggings like it was personally insulted by your attempts at warmth. Mountain men, trappers, traders, wanderers had one prime mission: survive the winter. That meant more than food and firewood. It meant walls that held, a roof that didn't fold under a storm, and a door that kept more than drafts out. A cabin wasn't comfort. It was a lifeline. Miss the mark, and the wolves would clean your bones before the thaw. Storms could gnash for a week, snow swallowing valleys, wind screaming through timber like a banshee choir. Early greenhorns tried lean-tos and canvas, then learned fast. Historical check. Even the iron-tough cause of discovery spent the winter of 1805-06 holed up at Fort Clatsop on the Oregon coast and called it misery. Damp, sickness, short rations. A cabin didn't guarantee ease, but it gave you a fighting chance. Of course, long nights breed tall tales. Some swore whiskey froze solid and had to be spooned. Likely not. But in snowbound dark, reality bends just enough to entertain. Here's where debates creep in. Were these men truly self-sufficient? Or did they lean hard on native nations for foodways, sheltercraft, and survival lore? Some scholars say the mountain man myth oversells independence. Others argue lasting even one winter demanded superhuman grit. Truth sits tangled in between, exchange plus determination. Back to you. Where do you begin? Without walls, every night becomes a grapple with frost. The forest around you is both generous and merciless, towering evergreens, demanding backbreaking labor to become beams, yet promising that resin-sweet smoke from a hearth you haven't built yet. You breathe out, a white cloud in knife-cold air. A raven croaks like it's making fun of your pace. Out here, the clock belongs to daylight and storms. The mountains don't care if your axe is dull or your fingers numb. Adapt or vanish. At night, the small fire pops. Ice cracks somewhere downriver. It's easy to believe you're the last human alive. No cabin means no insulation, nowhere to stash dried venison or pelts, no shelter for tools that must not rust. You think of the ones who failed, warnings buried under drifts, and yet hope flickers because the raw stuff is here. Wood, water, stone, game. The first winter might break you. If it doesn't, you'll carry a quiet pride city folk can't fathom. That's the paradox. Brutal yet oddly generous to those who ask it right. So build. This is the shift from wanderer to builder, from passing through to tentatively rooted. A cabin isn't just structure, it's a declaration. I belong here, for now. You grip the axe, flex stiff fingers, and start thinking like the men who carved lives from silence and timber. Lesson 1. Survival isn't random, it's strategic. Swinging all day means nothing if you put the cabin in the wrong place. Choosing a site is chess with frostbite and starvation instead of pawns. You walk the land, eyes narrowed against snow glare, reading terrain like an old hand. Low valleys feel cozy, but they're cold sinks where icy air pools. Too high and you re in avalanche lanes where a mountain can erase your weaker's work in seconds. You need balance, near water, sheltered by timber, high enough to catch sun. At a creek rimed with fragile ice, you hear future mornings, bucket gurgle, barrel splash. Fresh water is life, but build too near and spring floods will test your carpentry to death. You climb a gentle rise above a bend, circled by pines like a natural wall. You can already picture smoke curling from a rock chimney. Historically, this choice mattered as much as your tools. Trading posts hugged river junctions, the highways before roads, private cabins often tucked deeper, hidden from eyes and claws. Solitude doubled as security. Quirky rule of thumb: some men built where deer tracks crisscrossed, meat lives here. Others watched birds. If songbirds flitted even in cold months, the place was livable. Not peer-reviewed, but sometimes feathers beat guesswork. Scholars still wrangle, careful observation and sun mapping. Or find a clearing and pray, maybe both. Out here, strategy and gamble share the same mittens. In the hush, you kneel, scoop a handful of snow, and let it melt in your palm. You've chosen your ground. Next comes the work that decides whether you see spring or become another quiet warning under the drifts. The icy water drips down your wrist, and you feel the weight of the decision pressing on you. This isn't just about building walls, it's about creating a pocket of survival inside an ocean of danger. You listen to the soundscape, the muted rush of the creek, the groan of trees in the wind, the occasional crack of ice splitting somewhere unseen. All of it feels like the wilderness whispering whether it approves of your choice. You pull your coat tighter and mark the ground with your boot heel. This is where it begins. You imagine future nights, the wind screaming just beyond the log walls, while inside the cabin, the fire cast flickering shadows against rough-hewn planks. It's hard to picture warmth when your fingers are numb, but in a way that imagined comfort is already a kind of heat. The next hours are spent pacing the perimeter, stepping out the rough footprint of your soon-to-be cabin. You notice the slope, just enough to keep water running away instead of pooling by your walls. You check the tree line, close enough for timber, far enough that they won't crash down onto your roof during a storm. Every decision feels enormous, though it's mostly instinct, backed by the half-heard wisdom of those who've survived before. At sunset, you sit on a fallen log, watching the sky blush with fading light. The temperature drops with cruel speed, and the land stiffens around you. You wonder if you've chosen wisely, or if this rise will betray you come mid-winter. Doubt creeps in, as it always does. But then you remind yourself, every mountain man started with uncertainty. The only way to know for sure is to build and endure. And so with night gathering like a blanket of ink, you whisper a quiet promise to the ground beneath your boots. You'll shape this spot into something livable, something stubborn enough to resist the wild cold. Tomorrow, the real labor begins. Tonight, you rest with the knowledge that at least you've picked the stage for your survival story. Morning creeps into the wilderness slowly, as if even the sun doesn't really want to face the bitter chill. You wake stiff, wrapped in a blanket that never seems thick enough, and stretch your arms against the aching cold. Today, the land stops being just a backdrop. You're about to mark it, claim it, bend it into something resembling your own. No grand papers, no fences, no sheriff's office stamping approval. Out here, your title is whatever you can carve with an axe and a steady hand. Marking your territory is both declaration and defense. Without it, another wanderer might stroll by. Decide your spot looks cozy, and set up his own fire where yours should be. The first step is primitive but effective. Notching trees. You take your axe, lift it high, and bring it down with a satisfying thunk into the trunk of a spruce near the creek. Chips of bark fly, the sharp resin smell filling the air like pine incense. You carve a deep blaze mark visible from a distance, your sign that this ground is spoken for. You repeat the ritual on the trees that roughly outline your chosen rectangle. It's almost ceremonial. The wilderness doesn't care about your cuts, but you do, and that makes all the difference. Historically, this was common practice. Trappers, settlers, and even early surveyors left their marks on trees using notches, initials, or crude symbols to indicate boundaries. It wasn't foolproof, of course. A man's claim was only as strong as his ability to defend it. Still, it worked well enough that the tradition lasted for centuries. Some old blazed trees even survive today. The wilderness has always been filled with silent witnesses, trees, stones, and trails that hold the echoes of men who came before. Every mark on the bark, every pile of rocks, tells a story of survival, ambition, and sometimes desperation. But mountain men? They couldn't just leave a simple mark. They added twists, symbols, and mystery. Some carved more than lines into the trees, strange pictographs of animals, arrows, or crude faces. And, naturally, quirky stories grew around them. One legend tells of a trapper who carved a coiled snake into a tree, claiming it would scare off anyone who came near his trapping ground. Supposedly, locals avoided that spot for years. Maybe they feared a curse. Maybe they just respected the audacity of the man who claimed that land. Either way, it shows how even the wildest loners understood the power of suggestion. Quick thing before we dive in. If you enjoy these stories, hit like and subscribe. It really helps me out and helps this new channel reach 50,000 subscribers this month. Drop a comment and tell me where you're tuning in from and what time it is there. Historians still bicker over how important these marks really were. Some argue they were taken seriously, especially near rivers, passes, or hunting grounds where good land was scarce. Others say they were more symbolic, casual signs in a world too vast for strict territorial fights. The truth probably lies in that grey space where myth and practicality blur. Back then, negotiations weren't handled in fancy halls. They were done with grunts, glares, and occasionally a fist fight. Back in your boots, you take a step back and look at what you've done. The trees you've marked now form a rough, invisible fence. To others, the forest looks the same. But to you, this ground has changed. It's no longer just wilderness. It's the future site of your cabin, your claim. To seal the promise, you stack a few rocks at one corner. It's nothing impressive, just a crude marker, but it feels oddly satisfying. Like signing your name on the wild. You wonder how many others have done this before. How many piles of stones dot these mountains, each one a monument to stubborn survival. The work is simple but exhausting. You notch trees, carry stones, stamp your boots into the frozen ground until your legs burn. By the time the pale daylight fades, you feel a strange pride blooming in your chest. It is like you have built scaffolding for a future life. A fragile hope that somehow feels sturdier now. That night, as you huddle by the fire listening to the pop and crackle of the wood, you don't feel like a wanderer anymore. For the first time, you've carved boundaries in the endless wild. The wilderness hasn't welcomed you, but you've staked a claim anyway. A whisper to the dark saying, "I belong here." Morning comes sharp and clear. The sky is so blue it feels unreal, the snow glittering like shards of glass on the mountain's shoulders. It's beautiful, yes, but it's also a warning. Days like this don't last. Storms always lurk beyond the horizon. You tighten your belt, tug on stiff boots, and shoulder your axe. Today is about the hardest, most backbreaking task yet, bringing down the giants that will become the walls of your cabin. The forest ahead feels like a cathedral, breathtaking but dangerous. Every tree is both a potential savior and a challenge. You rest your palm on the rough bark of a towering pine and picture it standing strong as part of your shelter. This isn't just firewood, this is choosing which giants to sacrifice so that you can stand through the winter. Historically, these men relied on heavy steel axes traded from fir posts or blacksmiths. They weren't lightweight tools. They demanded rhythm, stamina, and grit. A skilled man might fell a tree in under an hour, but for most it was half a day of grueling labor. One historical fact: the Kentucky axe with its curved blade became famous in the early 1800s. With the right swing, it was all about momentum. Less brute force, more skill. Of course, campfire tales turned the mundane into myth. One story swears that a trapper named Big Jack cut down a cottonwood with just 5 swings. Unless Big Jack was half man, half grizzly, that's a stretch. But exaggeration was part of survival. It made the long nights bearable. Even today, historians debate whether men felled trees alone or teamed up. Some evidence suggests the lone mountain man image is overblown, and that partners often worked side by side, trading swings and jokes. Other accounts insist independence ruled, each man sweating in solitude, echoing only his own axe strokes. Either way, the work was brutal. Your hands blister as you swing. The sound of axe biting into wood echoes through the trees, thwack, 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 until it becomes a rhythm, a heartbeat of effort. Sap fills the air with its sharp, sweet scent. Sweat rolls down your spine despite the freezing cold. Steam rises from your shoulders like ghostly breath. Then finally the tree groans and falls. You step back, breath held, as it crashes down with a roar that shakes the earth beneath your boots. The silence that follows feels almost sacred. One giant down. Many more to go. By dusk, you've marked several trunks for walls and beams. Smaller branches are cleared, leaving behind raw timbers ready for hauling tomorrow. The sight of them piled in the snow fills you with grim pride. They're no longer just trees. They're the bones of your future home. That night by the fire, you let yourself dream for the first time. You imagine sturdy walls, a roof shedding snow like a shield, and the glow of firelight trapped safely inside. It's still just a vision, but it feels possible now. Each swing of the axe has brought you one step closer to survival. The next day brings a new challenge, moving those logs. Cutting them was one kind of misery. Hauling them into place, that's a whole new level. You stare at a single trunk, boots sinking into the crusted snow. It weighs hundreds of pounds, completely indifferent to your exhaustion. The old mountain men knew this struggle well. Without oxen or horses, it was all ropes, levers, and raw determination. If you were lucky, a mule might help. Stubborn but strong. If not, it was you versus the forest. Settlers often used skid poles, laying smaller logs as rails to roll heavy timbers. Crude, but life-saving for backs and bones. Tall tales tell of men dragging logs for miles single-handedly, boots carving trenches behind them. One particularly absurd story claims a trapper once hauled enough logs for an entire wall uphill in a single afternoon. Maybe there was whiskey involved. Or maybe, like most tales, the truth shrank and the legend grew. You knot a rope around a log, jam a lever under it, and strain until your muscles scream. It slides, slowly, grudgingly, across the snow. Each inch feels like victory. Hours pass in a blur of sweat, curses, and the biting sting of cold air in your lungs. By sunset, 3 logs rest in the clearing. They look like bones scattered across the snow, the skeleton of a cabin waiting to rise. You sink onto one of them, chest heaving, and let the silence soak in. The wilderness doesn't applaud, but you can feel its quiet respect. The next morning, a new task begins. Shape. Up until now, it's been about raw material, cutting and hauling. Now, you must envision a home. You stamp patterns into the snow, sketching with your boots until a simple rectangle forms, 4 walls 12 by 16 feet. Just enough space to survive, not enough to waste heat or energy. Historically, this size wasn't random. Scotch-Irish immigrants brought the design across oceans, perfecting it in Appalachia and beyond. It was efficient, practical, and passed from one generation to the next. Of course, there were always strange superstitions. Some men swore circular cabins kept heat in better. Others claimed odd shapes like pentagons confused evil spirits. Did anyone actually test these ideas in the Rockies? Probably not. But mixing belief with survival is as old as humanity itself. You carve shallow grooves into the frozen ground, marking your corners. 4 lines in the snow, 4 promises. It doesn't look like much, but you can already imagine it. Walls glowing in the firelight, shelves lined with dried meat, a roof shedding snow instead of caving under it. Small feels smart, small feels safe. You step back and take it in. The wilderness stretches endless around you, cold, vast, merciless. And yet, in this little box of marked earth, you've created something powerful: defiance. Your quiet refusal to let winter bury you, your whisper to the wild saying, "I will endure here." As you pace the boundaries again, you think about future details, where the door will stand, where light might creep through a tiny window, where you'll sit on storm days carving wood scraps into something vaguely useful. You imagine a hearth at one end, stones stacked high, smoke curling upward. None of it exists yet, but you can already see shadows dancing on those walls. Hear the muffled howl of wind outside. Smell the mix of smoke, pine, and tanned hides. The day slips by in small adjustments. You widen one side of the rectangle, shorten another, shuffle stones until the footprint feels balanced. It's not perfection you're after. It's survival geometry, where every foot shaved off means less wall to build, less roof to patch, less air to heat. By sundown, the outline is set. It may be invisible to anyone else, but to you it's the blueprint of survival etched into the frozen ground. That night, when the fire dies low, You lie awake imagining the rectangle taking form. You picture the first log being set down, the sound of it thudding into place, the slow rise of walls against the endless dark. It's almost enough to make you forget the cold, at least until the wind sneaks through your blanket again. But even then, you smile to yourself. The cabin is no longer a dream floating in your mind. It has a shape, a footprint, and soon the forest around you will bow to that design with the footprints scratched into the earth and stones sitting like silent sentinels at the corners. The next task stares at you with the patience of inevitability, shaping the ends of each log so they'll lock together. Without this, your cabin is just a stack of slippery timber waiting to collapse under the first snow load. Notching corners is the real craft where brute force meets skill, and where a man proves whether he can think as well as swing an axe. You kneel by the first log, your axe head gleaming faintly in the pale light, and mutter to yourself, "All right, let's make this stick." Notching has always been the quiet genius of cabin building. A proper notch ensures that logs fit snugly, overlapping without sliding apart. The most common method, the saddle notch, a rounded groove carved into the underside of a log so it can nestle against the curve of the one below. Historical fact: the saddle notch was a Scandinavian technique brought to America by immigrants, particularly those who settled in the northern states where timber was plentiful. Mountain men picked it up through observational necessity, adapting it to the tools and trees at hand. It wasn't fancy joinery, it was survival carpentry, rough but functional. Still, frontier folklore couldn't resist dressing it up. Some trappers swore that if you cut your notches on a waxing moon, the logs would last longer without rot. Others joked that the tighter the notch, the less likely walls would slip between the cracks at night. Practical advice? Not exactly, but when you're whittling into frozen wood by firelight, muttering about moon phases feels oddly reassuring. Scholars debate whether most cabins really used refined notching, or if many were simply cribbed logs stacked with minimal shaping gaps, chinked later with mud and moss. Some evidence suggests that lone trappers in a hurry went with crude builds while more permanent settlements leaned on the skill of notching to keep cabins standing for decades. Was every mountain man a careful craftsman? Or were most just hacking at wood until it stayed put? The truth, as usual, likely lies in the middle. You take your first swing, carving a shallow groove into the end of a log. Chips fly, sap glistens, and the cold air fills with that sweet resin smell again. The axe blade thuds rhythmically like a heartbeat against wood. It's painstaking work. You have to cut, test, cut again, shaving the curve just right, so one log can cradle the next without wobbling. After an hour, your shoulders scream, but you finally set the notched log atop its partner and watch it settle into place with a satisfying thunk. Suddenly, the outline in the snow isn't just imaginary anymore. It's beginning to rise. Each notch is a battle. The wood splinters stubbornly, sometimes tearing in uneven chunks that force you to adjust your cut. You wipe sweat from your forehead, even as icy wind bites your cheeks. The rhythm of axe against log becomes almost meditative. Swing, chip, adjust, test. You fall into a trance where the only sounds are steel biting wood and the occasional caw of a distant raven, as if the bird is critiquing your craftsmanship. By midday, you've managed to notch and stack 3 logs on one side, the walls beginning to form a waist-high barrier. The sight fills you with a strange pride. This isn't just labor anymore, it's structure. The rectangle is slowly becoming 3-dimensional, a boundary between inside and outside. You run your hand along the rough bark, feeling the grooves where your axe bit deep, and imagine these walls standing firm under storms that would flatten a lesser shelter. The work is slow, but the progress is visible, and that's fuel enough to keep going. You notch another log, muscles burning, breath puffing in white clouds, until the sun dips low and shadows stretch long across the snow. Exhausted, you step back and see the beginnings of a corner, a real corner, solid and interlocked. It may not look like much to anyone else, but to you, it's the hinge point between survival and surrender. That night, by the fire, you rub your blistered palms and stare into the flames. The day replays in your mind, the feel of the axe handle, the thunk of wood locking into wood, the silhouette of rising walls. You're no master carpenter, but you've crossed a threshold. With each notch cut, Each log stacked, you're teaching the wilderness that you're not just passing through. You're here to stay, at least as long as the snow lets you. By now, your clearing has the beginnings of walls. A waist-high outline of logs stacked with notches into each other like puzzle pieces. But a stack of logs is not a cabin until the walls rise tall enough to shut out the wind. This is where the real grind begins, raising logs that seem to get heavier with every layer. Each one must be lifted, rolled, and coaxed into place, and the higher you go, the more dangerous the work becomes. Standing there with your axe resting across your shoulders, you look up at the empty air above those rough corners and sigh. The wilderness isn't going to build your walls for you. Historically, raising log walls was the moment when a cabin began to feel like more than a camp. It was also the most backbreaking part of construction. Men used poles as ramps, rolling logs upward with levers or sheer brute strength, balancing them precariously before notching them into place. One fact worth remembering, pioneers often relied on a cribbing technique, stacking logs slightly inward with each layer to create stability. Some cabins even narrowed toward the roofline for this reason. It wasn't pretty, but it kept the structure standing when the snow came. Frontier folklore, of course, added spice to the tale. Some swore that certain mountain men could toss a log onto a wall single-handed, as if they were giants disguised in buckskin. Others told stories of cabins going up in a single day, raised so quickly that by sunset smoke was already curling from the chimney. Realistically, even with a team, building a cabin wall that fast would be miraculous. But around the fire, the stories kept spirits warm when bodies were cold. Scholarly debates circle around whether solitary trappers really built full-size cabins alone. Some evidence suggests they did slowly and painfully, dragging and lifting logs until exhaustion forced them to stop. Others argue that the iconic lone builder was more myth than reality, that most cabins were raised communally, with small groups pitching in so everyone had a roof before winter. Diaries and archaeological remains hint at both, leaving us to wonder if our image of the solitary mountain man is truth or just a legend we like better. Back in your clearing, it feels like the solitary version is your fate. You set up ramps from smaller poles, roll a log toward them, and begin the awkward dance of heaving it upward. Every muscle in your back strains. Your boots slip against the icy ground and the log groans as if mocking you. Slowly, inch by inch, you lever it into place, guiding it into its notch with a hollow thud that echoes through the trees. Standing back, you wipe sweat from your brow and grin. One more layer stands between you and the world. The day stretches into a blur of repetition. Roll, lift, notch, step back. The walls climb higher, each log adding weight and permanence to the structure. By mid-afternoon, you've reached chest height, and the wind that once tore through the clearing is now partially blocked. You notice the difference immediately. The fire in your pit doesn't sputter as much. Your breath doesn't carry so far. It's subtle, but it's proof that you're clawing your way toward real shelter. As the sun dips low, painting the snow in pink and gold, you pause to admire the skeleton of your cabin. The walls are uneven in places, gaps yawning where your notches weren't perfect, but it's unmistakably a structure now. The corners stand proud, the logs interlocked like hands clasped against the storm. You touch one of the upper beams, rough bark scraping your palm, and imagine the walls continuing upward until they cradle a roof. For the first time, the clearing doesn't feel like a campsite. It feels like a home in progress. That night, your body screams with fatigue. Every joint aches and your hands are raw despite your gloves. But as you lie near the fire, staring at the rough silhouette of walls rising in the dark, you feel a deep satisfaction. You've turned trees into shelter, muscle into permanence. The wilderness might still have the upper hand, but with each log raised, you're stealing a little ground back. And tomorrow you'll climb higher still, until the forest bows to the weight of your stubborn determination. Now the walls stand shoulder high, and the skeleton of your cabin has started to whisper promises of warmth. But between those stacked logs, winter still peers in like an uninvited guest. The gaps are as wide as a man's fingers, and the wind slides through them with cruel precision, sharp enough to sting your skin even when you're inside the half-finished shell. A cabin without sealed gaps is nothing more than a giant flute, one that whistles icy death straight into your bones. That's where the messy, overlooked, but utterly vital of chinking comes in. You squat near the wall, running your hand along the cold grooves where bark meets bark. The gaps gape like toothless mouths waiting to be stuffed with whatever you can find. Historically, that whatever was an eclectic mix. Moss, mud, clay, straw, even animal hair, all pressed into cracks to seal out the cold. One fact stands clear. Mountain men were nothing if not resourceful. Archaeologists have even found remnants of fur and shredded hides crammed between timbers in old cabins. Proof that nothing went to waste when warmth was on the line. Of course, the folklore around chinking leans more toward the absurd. Some tales claim trappers used chewed tobacco mixed with mud, swearing the smell kept away insects and spirits alike. Others insisted that a chunk of bear fat in the cracks made wolves more wolf-proof. Did anyone really slather their homes with lard? Probably not, unless they enjoyed being visited by every hungry animal in the forest. Still, when stories get told around a fire, practicality has a way of bowing to entertainment. Here's the scholarly debate. Was chinking more of a long-term craft or a slapdash solution? Some historians argue that careful chinking was a point of pride, done meticulously so a cabin could last years. Others point out that many trappers only needed their shelters for one winter, so they crammed in mud and moss quickly, with little care for how long it held. The divide reflects a larger question about these men. Were they truly building homes or just temporary cocoons until spring thaw? You kneel in the snow and begin your own patchwork. First, you gather moss, it's green, still stubborn under the frost. You pack it into the cracks, pressing hard with numb fingers until it clings like natural insulation. Next comes mud mixed with snow, stomped with your boots until it turns into something vaguely pliable. You smear it into the seams, your gloves coated, your breath hissing in irritation as clumps fall free. Slowly, the wall begins to look less like a sea and more like a shield. The process is exhausting and messy. You scrape your knuckles, mud crusts under your nails, and a chunk of half-frozen moss slides down your sleeve. But the difference is immediate. When you crouch inside your rising cabin and the wind howls outside, the breeze no longer slices through every crack. It's still cold, frigid even, but there's a noticeable dulling, as though the walls are learning to hold their ground against the elements. By midday, you've sealed most of the gaps on one side, your body aching in new ways from the crouching and pressing. The wall now looks like a patchwork quilt, green, brown, and frozen gray streaks marking your labor. Not pretty, but beauty isn't the goal. Survival is. You lean back, shoulders against the logs, and close your eyes. For a brief moment, it almost feels like the world has paused its assault, letting you rest in a bubble of stillness. As twilight settles in, you finish stuffing the last seam with a wad of moss and frozen mud. The cabin silhouette now feels sturdier, more dignified. It's not perfect. Snow melt will drip through, and some gaps will widen again with shifting wood. But for tonight, it's enough. The wilderness no longer blows through unchecked. Instead, it stops, presses against your handiwork, and hesitates. Later by the fire, you notice how the flames hold steady, no longer flickering violently with every gust. Your blanket feels a touch warmer. You smile into the darkness, mud still drying on your hands. This cabin may look rough, patched together like a beggar's coat, but in its seams lies the difference between despair and hope. And for the first time since you started, you believe you might actually outlast the winter. Your walls may be sturdy and your seams stuffed with moss and mud, but without a roof, you're still living in a glorified pen. Snow will fall straight in. Rain will soak your bedding, and the first storm will remind you how temporary your progress really is. The roof is what turns a pile of logs into a fortress, a lid on your box of survival. You step outside into the brittle air, looking at your half-built walls with a builder's eye. They're solid enough now to bear the weight, but the real question is what kind of covering you can manage before the skies open up. Historically, cabin roofs were as varied as the men who built them. Shakes split from logs, bark peeled from birches, sod heaved from the frozen ground, all were used depending on what the land offered. One clear fact: bark roofs were common in the Rockies, where pine and spruce shed wide sheets that could be stripped and laid in overlapping layers. They weren't waterproof forever, but they'd keep out snow for a season or two. Longer-term builders sometimes shaped planks into shingles or shakes, but that meant even more cutting, splitting, and fitting. A winter cabin often got the quick solution, because time was the enemy. The quirky tales around roofing are almost as creative as the roofs themselves. Some trappers swore that lining the roof with buffalo hides made it so snug you could smoke a pipe indoors, without a whisper escaping. Others joked about cabins so poorly built that owls nested between the rafters, swooping down to steal jerky right off the table. It's hard to say if any man truly waterproofed his home with animal skins, but the image of a wolfkin roof catching moonlight feels too stubbornly poetic to dismiss outright. Scholars still wrestle with the evidence. Were most mountain men content with bark and sod that barely lasted one winter? Or did they invest the time in proper shakes? Some argue that practicality always ruled. The goal was to survive, not decorate. Others suggest that when men stayed in one region longer, they put surprising care into their roofs, even experimenting with double layers or clever drainage systems. The debate touches a larger question. Were these cabins disposable tools, or the beginnings of something resembling permanence? For you, there's no luxury of endless choice. Bark is your ally. You score long cuts into the trunk of a nearby spruce, then pry loose sheets of bark, their inner sides damp and fibrous. They come off like stiff blankets, rough and uneven but wide enough to overlap. You haul them to the clearing, stack them by the wall and look up at the naked beams that will hold them. Each sheet will need to be wedged and weighted with smaller poles, a patchwork roof stitched together by sheer stubbornness. The work is clumsy, exhausting, and sometimes comical. You climb onto the half-raised walls, balancing awkwardly while hoisting sheets of bark overhead. The first one slips and smacks you in the face, leaving resin smeared across your cheek. Another cracks down the middle as you try to bend it into place. Still, piece by piece, the covering grows. You wedge poles across the sheets, pinning them tight so the wind can't peel them off in the first storm. By afternoon, half the roof is in place, and already the space inside feels different. The light dims, shadows stretch, and the air holds a muted hush. You stand inside your cabin for the first time under partial cover, and though the bark still leaks daylight through its cracks, it feels like stepping into another world. A world where the sky is no longer pressing directly down on you. As dusk bleeds into the treetops, you finish the last section, weighting the final sheet with 2 thick poles. You drop to the ground, every muscle trembling, and tilt your head back to admire your crooked but complete roof. From outside, it looks like a lumpy quilt draped over rough walls, but to you, it's nothing short of triumph. That night, the snowflakes drift lazily from the dark sky. You sit inside and watch them land on the bark above, sliding down instead of falling on your head. The firelight flickers against the low ceiling, and for the first time, the space feels like a room. Imperfect, leaky, but undeniably yours. You pull your blanket tighter, listening to the muffled hiss of snow outside, and think, a roof isn't just protection. It's proof. Proof that you've staked a claim, that you've wrestled a little more ground away from winter's grip. With the roof finally slung across your walls like a patchwork quilt, you step inside and take a long, satisfied breath. Then it hits you. Beneath your boots, the ground is still just frozen earth, uneven, damp, and cold enough to suck the warmth straight out of your bones. A man can pile logs high and lay bark thick, but if he spends his nights lying on raw dirt, winter will creep into his body from the ground up. The next task is unavoidable: crafting a floor, or at least taming the one nature gave you. Historically, most cabins started with dirt floors tamped down until they were hard as stone. It wasn't glamorous, but it was practical. Some settlers later added plank flooring when they had time and saws enough to spare. But for mountain men rushing against the clock of winter, packed earth was the norm. Here's a fact. Accounts from early frontier forts describe soldiers sprinkling sand over their dirt floors to keep them dry, replacing it when it grew foul. The dirt floor was humble, but it worked, provided you kept it clean and solid. Naturally, frontier lore had to make dirt floors sound more colorful than they were. Some claimed the trick was to pour whiskey into the soil before tamping it because it hardened faster. Others swore a floor sprinkled with ashes from the first fire would drive away evil spirits and nosy rodents alike. Did anyone actually waste whiskey on mud? Doubtful, though. Maybe one drunk trapper gave it a try. Still, the stories prove that even the ground beneath your boots became fertile soil for superstition. And then there's the scholarly argument. Were dirt floors really good enough? Or were they simply the best that desperate men could manage? Some historians argue that the simple earth floor was efficient and low maintenance, while others insist it was a mark of poverty and transience, replaced whenever possible with planks. The debate isn't just about flooring. It's about whether mountain men were content with impermanence or secretly longed for something closer to the homes they'd left behind. You grab a stout branch and begin raking the ground inside your cabin, scraping away roots, rocks, and frozen clumps. The work is slow and tedious, but it begins to reveal patches of smoother soil. Then comes the tamping, stomping, and pounding with your boots, driving the ground flat. Your legs aching with the repetition. The sound is dull and heavy, like drum beats in the belly of the earth. Slowly, the cabin floor starts to feel less like a patch of wilderness and more like a surface meant for living. You decide to sprinkle a thin layer of sand and ash from last night's fire across one corner, packing it in as you go. The scent of charred wood mixes with damp soil, earthy and smoky, oddly comforting. It feels like sealing the ground with a ritual, binding it to your survival. When you kneel and press your palm against the packed dirt, it no longer crumbles beneath your hand. It holds. By midday, you've managed to smooth and tamp the entire footprint. The space feels different now. When you step inside, your boots don't sink awkwardly, and the cold doesn't radiate up quite as fiercely. It's still dirt, yes, but it's dirt transformed, ordered, tamed, claimed. You imagine throwing down a fur robe, stretching out and finally sleeping without feeling like the earth itself is gnawing the heat from your bones. Later, as you sit by your fire staring at the finished floor, you realize how symbolic this step feels. Walls may shield you, roofs may cover you, but the floor is what roots you. You're no longer camped on the forest edge. You're standing in a place shaped by your hands, pressed into permanence beneath your feet. It's a subtle difference, but one that makes you feel, perhaps for the first time, that you belong here. That night, when you lay your blanket on the packed ground, it doesn't feel like wilderness anymore. It feels like a room. The fire crackles, the roof shelters, and the dirt beneath you holds steady. The storm howls outside, but inside you drift towards sleep, lulled by the quiet pride of knowing that even the earth itself has been pressed into service for your survival. Your cabin now has walls that block the wind, seams stuffed with moss, and a roof that shrugs off the first snowflakes. The ground beneath your boots is tamped and firm, no longer a marsh of frozen roots, but one truthin' at you in the quiet of night. Without a fire, none of this matters. You can sleep under a roof. You can sprawl across a floor. But if you don't build a hearth, the cold will seep in and finish what hunger and exhaustion couldn't. A hearth isn't just warmth, it's the heart of the cabin. The line between shelter and tomb. You step outside, scanning the creek bank for stones. The ground crunches beneath your boots, and frost sparks in the pale light. Rocks are heavy, awkward, and reluctant to move, but they're essential. Historically, mountain cabins almost always featured a stone hearth, however crude. It wasn't a luxury, it was survival. Fireplaces drew smoke upward away from lungs, while their thick walls stored heat, radiating it long after flames died down. Fact, archaeologists have found traces of soot-stained chimneys still standing centuries after the cabins themselves rotted away. The stone outlives the wood, just as fire outlives the cold for a while. The folklore around fireplaces, though, adds a strange charm. Some men swore that if you laid your first stone crooked, no matter how you rebuilt, the chimney would always smoke back into the cabin. Others claimed that tossing a silver coin into the mortar would keep lightning from striking the roof. There's even a tale about a trapper who lined his hearth with bones instead of stones, insisting it burned hotter. Did anyone really roast venison over a fireplace built of femurs? Hopefully not, but out here, who knows? Scholars argue endlessly about how sophisticated these hearths really were. Some insist that most were crude piles of stones, little more than smoky fire pits shoved against a wall. Others point to evidence of carefully mortared chimneys crafted with skill and meant to last. Were mountain men just scraping by with temporary fixes? Or did some of them bring genuine masonry knowledge into the wilderness? The debate underscores how varied these builders really were. Part survivalists, part artisans, depending on who held the axe and shovel. Back in your clearing, you haul stone after stone to the cabin, stacking them into a rough square at one end of the room. The labor is punishing. Your shoulders groan, your back protests, and your gloves wear thin. Still the pile grows, stone faces grinding against one another, with a sound that feels older than history itself. You smear mud between gaps, crude mortar that will harden in the cold, sealing cracks just enough to hold. The chimney rises log by log, each stone locked into the next until it reaches above the cabin wall. Smoke must rise, not linger, if you want to keep your lungs clear and your nights warm. By mid-afternoon, the hearth is complete. A squat, uneven tower of rock pressed together with determination more than skill. It isn't pretty, but it has presence, a weight that makes the cabin feel anchored. You kneel before it, hands roar and strike flint against steel. Sparks shower onto a twist of dry moss which smolders, then catches. Flames lick upward, crackling against the cold air. You feed the fire carefully, sticks first, then thicker branches until the hearth glows with steady light. The smoke rises, curling through the chimney. A little seeps back, stinging your eyes, but most drifts upward, spilling into the night. You laugh hoarse-arrow and relieved. It works. The cabin fills with warmth, faint at first, but undeniable, seeping into your clothes, thawing your fingers, loosening the knot in your chest. For the first time, you're not just hiding from the cold, you're fighting it back. That night, you lie beside the flickering hearth, listening to the stones tick and groan as they expand in the heat. The fire pops, sparks leap, and shadows dance across the rough log walls. The air smells of smoke and pine resin, sharp yet comforting. You close your eyes and think of how far you've come. From sleeping under the sky to resting within walls that hold both flame and hope. The cabin is still raw, unfinished, fragile in the face of true winter, but tonight it feels alive. The hearth has given it a heart. And you know, as long as fire burns within these stones, you've carved out one small circle of warmth in a wilderness determined to freeze you out. With fire dancing inside your new stone hearth, your cabin finally breathes warmth into the frozen night. But every time you step outside, a gust of wind shoves the cold back in through the yawning entrance. You've got walls, a roof, even a glowing chimney. But without a door, you're living in a box with one side missing. Tonight, while you try to sleep, the wind winds through the open frame like a wolf testing your patience. Tomorrow you'll wrestle with lumber again, this time to make a barrier that swings shut and keeps the wilderness on the other side. Doors on frontier cabins were never elegant, but they were always essential. Historical fact: most were fashioned from vertical planks split from logs, fastened together with cross braces, and hung on simple wooden hinges. Iron hardware was rare in the wilderness, unless you'd hauled it from a trading post. So ingenuity took the place of blacksmith skill. Leather straps, wooden pegs, even rawhide lashing stood in for hinges. The door wasn't about style. It was about survival, keeping bears, snow, and nosy neighbors out while trapping the fragile warmth within. Of course, trappers told stranger stories about their doors. One legend claimed a man used a single slab of bark so wide it served as both door and conversation piece. Another tale tells of a mountain hermit whose door was nothing more than a stretched buffalo hide. Supposedly, he said, it kept out the cold just fine, though it must have flapped like a drum every time the wind blew. Quirky, definitely practical, only until the first blizzard tore it loose. Scholars debate how carefully these doors were made. Some argue that even the roughest cabins had surprisingly solid entrances, since losing a door mid-winter could mean death. Others suggest that many trappers made do with crude coverings, blankets of hide. Slabs leaned in place because the cabin itself was meant to last only one season. Was every mountain man carving out a sturdy swinging door, or did most accept the bare minimum so they could focus on trapping and trade? The evidence is scattered, leaving you to build your own answer. Back in your clearing, you select a straight pine log and split it lengthwise, sweat steaming off your back despite the icy air. The planks are rough, uneven, but wide enough to line up side by side. You lay them flat, brace them across with shorter pieces, and hammer in wooden pegs you've whittled from spare branches. Slowly, a slab of wood begins to take shape, heavy and awkward but solid. You heave it upright, resting it against the open frame, and can't help but grin. For the first time, the cabin feels like it has a face. The hinges are trickier. You slice thick strips of rawhide, stretching them until they're taut, then loop them through holes in the door and cabin frame. They creak as you test the swing, stiff but workable. The door groans when you push it, scraping against the packed dirt floor, but eventually it settles shut with a heavy thud. The sound reverberates through the small cabin like a drumbeat of triumph. You step outside, take hold of the rough wooden handle you've shaped, and pull it closed behind you. The cabin disappears from sight, swallowed in shadow, but the thud of the door tells you it's there, holding. You open it again, step back inside, and close it once more. Each repetition feels like a spell, open to the wild, shut for safety. The ritual of it fills you with quiet satisfaction. That night you lie close to the fire, listening to the wind push and claw at the walls. The door rattles faintly, its rawhide hinges stretching and settling, but it holds. No more icy drafts cutting straight through your bones. No more snow drifting in by the handful. Just the glow of the hearth, the hush of your cabin, and the knowledge that you've drawn a line between yourself and everything outside. For the first time, the wilderness is on the other side of a barrier you built with your own hands. The door groans on its rawhide hinges, creaking like an old voice remembering storms past. The stone hearth glows faintly, its warmth pushing back against the bitter cold that presses from every side. Beneath your boots, the packed dirt floor lies flat, solid, and strangely comforting. For the first time, your cabin feels less like a fragile box in the wilderness and more like a fortress. Rough, imperfect but yours. Still, something is missing. A cabin without fire is just a shell. Without that living, breathing flame, it's nothing more than stacked logs waiting to be claimed by the cold. Tonight, that changes. Tonight, you'll light your first true fire in the hearth and find out if these walls can hold back the winter that's been clawing at your door since the first snow fell. Historically, the first fire wasn't just practical, it was ritual. For early settlers, that moment carried spiritual weight. A single flame meant victory over the dark. It meant human warmth had staked its claim in a world that often seemed determined to erase it. In some traditions brought over from Europe, settlers would even borrow live embers from a neighbor's hearth to light their first fire. It symbolized connection and community, a reminder that even in isolation, they weren't completely alone. But for the mountain men who often lived far from anyone else, this ritual was personal, private. When that first curl of smoke rose from a new chimney, it was a declaration. I survived long enough to build this, naturally. Superstition crept in too. Some trappers swore you had to light your first fire using shavings from the same tree that formed your roof beams, or else your cabin would never truly be safe. Others believed that if the first night's fire smoked too heavily, it meant the land itself rejected you, a haunted place cursed from the start. Real or imagined, these beliefs reveal how deeply men feared and revered this moment. Fire wasn't just warmth, it was fate. You crouch before the hearth, flint and steel in hand. At the base you lay curls of birch bark, pale and papery, ready to catch. Over them, you stack dry twigs, then thicker sticks, then a split log light enough to bite fast. The first strike of flint sparks weakly and dies. The second lands, glowing like a single firefly in the dark. You lean close, breath steady, coaxing it into life. The bark smolders, curls black, then bursts into orange flame. The twigs catch, snapping and crackling like impatient voices. Smoke fills your eyes with tears before it finds the chimney's throat and escapes into the night. Relief crashes through you. You add another log, then another, feeding the newborn fire until it grows strong and sure. Shadows leap across the log walls, stretching like dancers summoned by your will. The heat rolls outward, thawing your chest, loosening muscles that have been tight for weeks. The smell of smoke mingles with resin and damp earth. The fire's crackle becomes a heartbeat, answering your own. For the first time you sit back and breathe. The cabin isn't just shelter anymore. It's alive because the fire lives. As the night deepens, the storm howls outside, snow hissing against bark, the wind clawing at the door, but inside the warmth pushes back. You think of those who came before, men who froze, men who failed, and men who survived because they reached this moment. Now, you're part of that lineage. When you finally lie down, the hearth glowing beside you, you understand something profound. As long as you keep feeding those flames, winter can rage, but it cannot claim you, not tonight. The fire hums low in the hearth the next morning. Its glow gentle now, like an old friend. The roof groans under fresh snow. The door thuds softly as the wind tests its strength. You've built yourself a box against the storm, but inside, it's barren. Just a dirt floor, smoke-streaked walls, and a single blanket tossed near the fire. Survival isn't just about keeping the cold out. It's about creating a space you can live in. However rough, without places to sit, store food, or stretch your legs without lying in ash, the cabin will drive you mad before spring arrives. It's time to turn spare wood into something more than fuel. It's time to build a home. Historically, frontier furniture was as practical as the men who built it. Rough-hewn stools, plank. Tables, raised sleeping platforms, filled with straw and furs to keep men off the damp. Ground, shelves carved directly into walls. For tools and food, nothing was ornamental. Every piece had to earn its keep. And yet these crude creations marked the first steps towards civilization. A table wasn't just a table, it was a claim. Proof that you weren't just surviving. You were living. There were stories, of course. One trapper carved a stool so lopsided it rocked constantly. Instead of fixing it, he bragged that it was self-rocking. Another built his bunk so close to the fire that sparks routinely singed his blankets. But he refused to move it because the warmth was worth the risk. Comfort, it seems, was negotiable in the Rockies. Scholars still argue over how much effort men put into their interiors. Some insist cabins were bare bones, a fire, a bedroll and meat hanging from rafters. Others believe solitude drove men to whittle and carve, creating spoons, stools, even little decorations to fight off the crushing silence. Whichever side is right, one truth remains: a cabin wasn't just a shield from winter. It was a mirror of the man inside. Back in your cabin, you split a leftover log into planks. 2 rough boards become a stool, wobbly but functional. When you sit on it by the fire, the relief is instant. No more crouching in the dirt like an animal. Encouraged, you lash together a simple raised bed, layering it with pine boughs and furs. It looks crude, but when you lie down, you're spared the damp chill of the floor. That small elevation feels like luxury. By midday, you've carved shallow shelves into the walls, notches to hold flint, knives, and precious strips of dried meat. A branch peg becomes a hook for your coat. Piece by piece, the cabin transforms. It's still rough, but no longer empty. Every item whispers to the wilderness, "This is mine, and I will stay." As evening falls, you sit on your crooked stool, staring into the fire. Around you, shadows flicker over shelves, bed, and hearth. It isn't beautiful. It isn't permanent, but it feels like a home. Later, you lie on your makeshift bed as the fire cracks softly. Snow rattles against the walls. The cabin creaks and sighs like it's settling. And for the night, then scritch, scritch, scritch. Something small darts across the floor, a tail flicks. Hair blur vanishes beneath a log. You sigh. Turns out you're not the only one who thinks this cabin is a good place to survive the winter. Historically, men rarely lived truly alone out here. Dogs were the most loyal companions, guarding supplies, warning of predators, and curling up by the fire for shared warmth. Journals describe them sleeping pressed tight to their masters through long, frozen nights, but not every guest was welcome. Mice, squirrels, insects, all inevitable invaders. A cabin was never entirely yours. It belonged to whatever could slip through the cracks. One legend tells of a trapper who befriended a weasel, feeding it scraps in exchange for pest control. Another, likely exaggerated, claims a man raised a bear cub inside his cabin until the day it smashed through the door and wandered off for good. Your own situation is far less dramatic. A pair of mouse eyes gleam from a gap in the wall. You mutter a curse, wrap your food tighter, and shove it higher on the shelf. Your dog lifts his head at the noise, ears twitching, then curls back against you. His steady breathing grounds you more than you'd like to admit. Because out here, silence isn't just quiet, it's a weight. Every creak of the logs, every whisper of wind becomes amplified until loneliness itself feels alive. Sometimes, even a thieving mouse feels like proof that you're not completely forgotten. By morning, you wake to a new pattern stitched across your dirt floor. Tiny mouse tracks winding between your boots and the fire. Your dog noses at a gap in the wall, growling softly. You sigh, toss more wood onto the fire, and stretch your aching limbs. The storm outside hasn't ended, but inside, you've built something that holds a room aflame, a place where life in all its messy forms still lingers, shared with creatures great and small, chosen and unchosen. Out here, companionship isn't about preference. It's about survival, and sometimes about simply having another heartbeat in the dark. The cabin breathes warmth now, its hearth glowing like a stubborn heart, its door groaning shut against the storm. You've got a stool, a bunk, and even your dog curled close. But the fire doesn't feed itself, and neither do you. Out here, you're not building a cabin to admire it. You're building it so you can have a place to eat, sleep, and keep your belly full. Without food, all this work becomes your coffin. The next task is as old as survival itself. Hunting and storing enough to last through the winter's long, starless nights. Historically, mountain men relied heavily on game. Deer, elk, bison, and smaller animals like rabbits filled their traps and bellies. Preservation was the real trick. Fresh meat would freeze outside, yes, but once thawed it could spoil fast. Fact, many trappers smoked meat over low fires, building racks from green branches and letting the smoke dry the flesh into strips of jerky. Fat was rendered into tallow, poured over dried meat and berries to create pemmican, a dense, long-lasting ration borrowed from native traditions. Without these methods, no man could carry enough food to see him through. The quirky stories around meat storage run wild. Some men swore by hanging their venison high in the trees out of reach of bears, though more than a few returned to find clever animals had climbed up anyway. Others joked about burying meat beneath the snow, only to dig it up months later, frozen solid like nature's icebox. One tale insists a trapper lost half his winter supply because he used his jerky rack as a drying line for socks, and a wolf pack took advantage of the smell. True. Hard to say, but it makes you think twice about multitasking with food. Scholars argue over how much foresight mountain men actually had when it came to storage. Some accounts suggest they were meticulous, carefully rationing and stockpiling. Others hint at recklessness, eating heartily while the supply was fresh and only realizing their mistake when hunger set in. The debate reflects a deeper truth. Not every survivor was wise, and not every winter was forgiving. A single misstep could mean starvation, no matter how sturdy the cabin. Back in your clearing, you shoulder your rifle and step into the snow. The world outside your cabin is sharp and silent, every branch dusted in white, every breath hanging in the air like smoke. You track deer along the creek, their hoofs leaving clean stamps in the powder. Hours pass before you find one, its head lowered to drink at an icy pool. You steady your breath, aim, and fire. The crack echoes through the valley and the deer collapses. The kill fills you with both triumph and guilt. The paradox of survival. Dragging it back to the cabin tests every ounce of strength. The carcass slides across the snow, leaving a red trail behind. Your dog trots ahead, eager, his nose twitching at the smell. By the time you reach the cabin, your back aches, but the sight of the deer hanging from a makeshift rack outside fills you with relief. You skin it quickly, hands stiff with cold, then slice the meat into strips. Smoke curls upward as you build a low fire, laying the strips across green branches. The scent of venison fills the air, rich and earthy, a promise of meals to come. By evening, strips of drying meat sway gently above the smoke, and rendered fat bubbles in a pot near the fire. You stir in berries you gathered earlier in the season, shaping rough cakes of pemmican that cool into dense, heavy blocks. You tuck them onto a shelf inside, knowing each one might buy you another day of life when storms rage and the forest goes quiet. That night, the cabin smells of smoke, fat, and drying venison. It isn't pleasant exactly, but it's the smell of security. You sit on your wobbly stool, watching sparks leap in the hearth and feel a rare ease. Food is hanging, drying, and waiting. The wilderness may still be vast and merciless, but tonight you've pulled something from it and claimed it as your own. Hunger won't be your undoing, not yet. The meat hangs above your smoke fire outside, strips stiffening as they dry. Inside, pemmican blocks sit on the shelf, dense little anchors against the fear of hunger. For now, your belly is steady, your fire alive, and your cabin solid. But winter isn't only about fighting the elements, it's about enduring time itself. Out here, the snow doesn't just fall, it traps. Storms roll in and bury the forest in silence, pressing you into your cabin for days, even weeks. Food may last, firewood may hold, but the real danger creeps in from the inside. Boredom, restlessness, and the madness of too much silence. Historically, men snowbound in the Rockies often turn to small repetitive crafts to keep from unraveling. Whittling knives carve spoons, bowls, and pipes from leftover wood. Fact, archaeological digs at frontier sites turn up surprisingly ornate wooden tools and trinkets, proof that idle hands rarely stayed idle. Men repaired gear endlessly too, patching moccasins, sharpening blades, re-ringing traps. It wasn't just utility, it was survival of the mind. Busy hands kept despair at bay, frontier tales painted wilder. Some men swore they talked to their rifles by the third month of snowbound solitude, naming them like old friends. Others joked about carving a chess set and playing both sides, arguing with themselves over strategy. Humor and truth blur fast when you haven't heard another human voice in weeks. Scholars still argue how crushing the loneliness really was. Some mountain men seemed built for silence, thriving on independence. Others confess in journals that they nearly unraveled, counting cracks in the walls, hearing voices in the wind, taking reckless risks just to feel alive. Both realities fit. Back in your cabin, the first real storm arrives. Snow starts as a whisper, grows into a hiss against the bark roof. Wind shoulders the door until you wedge a log against it. The world fades to white. You sit by the fire, knife in hand, shaving curls from a branch. At first it's fidgeting, then a spoon appears, lopsided yours. Hours slip past to the scrape of blade on wood. Each small ritual keeps your thoughts from turning too sharply inward. The silence still presses. You murmur to the dog. You answer the fire when it pops like it's made a point. Some nights the storm's voice sounds human, until you laugh at yourself and feed the flames. The wilderness is vast, but the mind is vaster. Both need taming. When the storm finally eases, you push open the door into a world buried to the ribs in snow. The path to the smoke rack is gone. But you feel oddly renewed. The cabin held, your mind held. The little pile of carved spoons and pegs gleams like treasure. Surviving the cold is one thing. Surviving yourself is another. For now you've managed both. Days later, the crunch of footsteps breaks the hush. Human, deliberate, you pause, hand near the rifle. The wilderness may be lonely, but it isn't empty. Historically, mountain men were less isolated than the myth suggests. Winter visits, tobacco for coffee, ammo for meat, news for silence kept people sane. One story tells of a stranger with nothing but a fiddle, playing so fierce wolves howled along outside. Another has two trappers measuring the last tin of coffee with solemn spoonfuls for 3 days straight. Exaggeration, sure, but they capture how strange human contact feels after weeks of quiet. Some men formed tiny winter constellations of cabins. Others avoided neighbors on principle. Pride and loneliness wrestled all season. You open the door. A man in buckskins, beard rimed with ice, lifts a hand. Got coffee to trade? Relief and wariness knot in your chest. You nod him in. Soon the room fills with new sounds. Boots thudding, tin clinking, a second voice. You swap bitter coffee for dried tobacco and a strip of smoked elk. And the taste is sweeter, because you didn't make it yourself. Stories loosen. Avalanches dodged, traps raided by clever wolves, rumors of a spring rendezvous. Firelight glints off 2 pairs of eyes. For a while the wilderness backs away from the threshold. When he leaves at dawn, the cabin feels too quiet, and sturdier somehow. The visit leaves an echo. You're not the only soul fighting this winter. Night stretches. Legends grow. Men everywhere tell stories to shrink the dark. On the frontier, history and imagination braided into folklore. Hairy wild men at the timberline, ghost lights drifting through trees, cabins creaking with the voices of the logs they were cut from. Did anyone believe? Maybe. Maybe it was just another way to keep the void from swallowing the room. Your fire pops, shadows lean. The dog's ears prick towards something you can't hear. Just the wind, you say, and carve a little wooden figure, a crooked, grinning guest, and set him on the shelf. Between the dog at your feet and the wooden listener near the hearth, the place feels less empty. Perhaps that's how legends start, not from ghosts outside, but from the need to fill silence with something besides your own breathing. The cabin talks back to you now, creaks, drafts adrip where snowmelt finds a seam. Out here, a builder is never done. Repairs are a way of life. Archaeologists find walls stuffed with layers, moss at the base, mud mid-wall, straw higher up, each season's fix tucked into the last. Folklore adds charm. Patch a roof with sod during a storm and it'll never leak. Nail a horseshoe over the door to keep the logs from wandering. If smoke won't draw, knock a hole and call it a window. Some cabins were patched for years. Others were one winter shells abandoned to rot. Both stories are true somewhere. You stuff more moss in a drafty corner. Carve a narrow shelf above the bunk for flint, knife, pemmican. Shovel the roof, lay fresh bark where water sneaks in. Small work, big comfort. Your mind wanders toward luxuries. A pane of glass, smooth floor planks, a real bed frame. Dreams for another life, but the dreaming itself is warmth. Not every visitor wears buckskin. One day a figure wrapped in hides appears at the tree line, bow slung across his back. You lift an open hand and gesture toward the fire. He steps inside, eyes sharp. Historically, mountain men survived by learning. From snowshoes to pemmican to snug chinking techniques, knowledge shared by the people who knew this land long before you. Trade stitched lives together. Furs for herbs, knives, beads, firearms. Friendship and suspicion traveled the same trails. He unwraps bitter herbs and shows you how to crush them into a tea that heats you better than coffee. His glance at your notches says plainly, "You've much to learn." You laugh, invite instruction with a gesture. Few words, but the meaning is clear. When he leaves, the cabin feels connected. One bead on a longer strand. Storms ease. Philosophy arrives. Freedom tastes sharp and honest out here, but it has a price. Hunger if you fail, madness if you falter, death if you misjudge the land. Journals hold both boasts and doubts. Some men wrote that the wilderness spoke to them. trees offering counsel, rivers passing judgment. One hermit supposedly carved this into a wall. Freedom's worth the frost, but not the grave. Myth, truth, or both, it nails the balance every man weighs. Your fire sinks to coals. You sip bitter tea and run a palm over the tool-marked logs. Each notch is defiance and also necessity. Maybe those are the same thing. Your dog shifts closer. You don't have the answer, only the resolve. Out here, philosophy is carved into calluses and counted in nights survived, then change. The air softens. A whisper of water runs under snow. The thaw has begun. Historically, melt is blessing and hazard. Rivers crack free, trails open, birds return, and roofs collapse, floods rise, winter's hidden dead are found. Some men bolted for trade as soon as streams sang. Others waited for avalanches to settle. It depended on the snowpack, the hunger, the man. You hear the creek loosen. Bear tracks print the slush by your rack. Life stirring. Inside, the roof sags where wet snow clung. Chinking crumbles. Drips carve tiny rivers in the dirt. Messy, yes, but proof the cabin stood. Scars as badges. Day by day, snow shrinks back from trunks, leaving dark halos of thawed earth. Birds grow bolder. The forest stops holding its breath. You tilt your face to the pale sun and let it touch skin that forgot this kind of heat. For the first time in months, you feel something like living, not merely surviving. Spring doesn't promise safety, only change. But after so much stillness, change is a gift. The snow retreats from your walls, leaving muddy marks where drifts once leaned hard. Water ribbons past the threshold. You study what you built. Crooked roof, patched seams, stubborn door. Not pretty, not permanent, but it stands. Historically, many cabins like this were left behind with the melt. Trappers moved on, chasing beaver rendezvous posts. Some shelters rotted where they sat. Others were reused, renamed, woven into the landscape's memory, so-and-so's cabin. The wilderness kept what it wanted and swallowed the rest. Folklore clung to the ruins. Some swore abandoned cabins were lucky, others haunted. One tale tells of a hut that outlasted 3 generations of wanderers. The wall more initials than wood by the end. Heroic? Maybe, maybe not. Either way, a cabin could become more than a stack of logs. It could become a story. You walk the perimeter one last time, palm on bark scarred by your work. You can hear the echoes. Axe thud, rope groan, the first fire catching, the long patient nights. You think about what's next. The river's opening, the trail's calling. Perhaps you'll leave this place for the next wanderer. Maybe they'll curse your door and bless your hearth. Maybe the forest will reclaim it, moss climbing until only the chimney stands like a headstone for the winter you survived. Evening. One more sit on the wobbly stool. One more look at shadows dancing across walls you raised with bleeding hands. The dog sighs. The creek sings louder than it has in months. You close your eyes, fire pop, water murmur. Promise, this cabin was never meant to be forever. But it was enough. Enough to keep you alive. Enough to carve your story into the wild. Enough to prove that against the most merciless winter, a man with an axe, a flame and stubborn will can leave something that lasts. That's legacy enough.